Hello and welcome to another edition of Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. This is our last of our author interviews for the year, but I'm very, very excited because I think we may have saved one of the best for last. I would love to introduce you to the author of this wonderful book. Would you like to tell us who you are and what your book is?
I am Meg Waite Clayton. This is my latest. It's my eighth novel. It's called The Postmistress of Paris. And it is basically a story about a young woman, a young American heiress from Chicago, near where I grew up, who finds herself in France as Hitler invades. And instead of leaving with all the other expats, she stays and ends up working in a real effort with a fellow named Varian Fry, who helped rescue artists and writers and other intellectuals, getting them out of France as it was Vichy France and Hitler occupied France. So it's about her, and it's also about an artist named Edward who is interned in France early in the book. I don't think that spoils too much to say it, that the French also interned refugees, just like the Germans did, just like, honestly, we here in the United States interned Japanese Americans. And so it's that journey. It's one part a love story. It's one part an adventure story. It's, I hope, a very meaningful read. And the San Francisco Chronicle called it Casablanca if Rick had an artsy bent and powerful.
I like that. I like it a lot. One of my favorite films, so quite an
Yeah,
adventure.
and it's been a beautiful launch. It was a people pick. It was just Friday. It was the new Good Morning America pick, and it's one of those rare circumstances in publishing where everything seems to be going pretty well. So.
Good. Well, I love seeing that because this really was such a wonderful read. And it was one of those things where I told you a little bit while we were talking, I'm in the middle of editing my own book. And when you do that, sometimes it's hard for me at least to settle my brain on one thing. And I picked this up and I just thought it's beautifully written. It's wonderful, wonderful characters through this book. And it's just an incredible story as well. So I've got lots of questions. I want to make sure that we dive in. I also want to remind people that you can also ask questions because I know this book has been out for a little bit, so we might have people who have read it or who have questions about everything from the book to writing process, all sorts of things. So just jumping right in, I suppose the most simple, straightforward question is, why this book? Why did you decide to write about these characters and this story?
That is a really good question. And, kind of the short answer is that I had some ideas for various books, and when my last book, which is called The Last Train to London, it sold to HarperCollins, and they offered me a two-book deal. And so I took these other ideas. I mean, I think most of us have a few ideas for what we might write next, and I took these ideas and kicked them around with my editor. And so we chose this together. But this is the one that I wanted to write next. This is the one that I had the research most far along on, and what I was really jazzed about. And I'll tell you, the reason I wanted to write it was because I found a real life heroine. Her name is Mary Jane Gold. She was a Chicago heiress who really did stay in France during the period and I found that really inspiring. I'm always looking for great stories about women doing extraordinary things. I think a long arc of literature is men doing extraordinary things, and
Yes.
I like to contribute a little of our gender to that. So she really captured me. The artists, what the artists did and endured, and how they got out, really captured me, and I was interested in exploring it.
Well, I think I knew there was something really unique about this book very, very early on when you have a heroine and it opens with her sort of doing some pretty daring things. And then she, whips off the clothes that she was wearing and pours herself into a Chanel dress and goes to a gathering of a bunch of surrealist artists. And I thought, this is an interesting world and this is an interesting woman. So I can understand why you might have been drawn to her. But how do you balance how do you strike the right balance between fictionalizing somebody in sort of a more biographical novel, as we see sometimes, and then building a character off of somebody who was a real person, but maybe you're really just drawing the inspiration from them, as opposed to hitting all of the exact points of their life?
Yeah. For me, it always starts with the story. What story I'm trying to tell, uh, what is kind of the main arc of the story. And for me, for as I came to this one, the main arc of the story was this effort to get artists and intellectuals out of France. And so for my last book, which The Last Train to London, that's a story about the Kindertransport. It's about getting children out of the Reich before World War II began, in what would turn out to be the 9 months before World War II began. In that story, the my protagonist is a woman named Truus Weissmuller, and for her part of the story, I stuck so closely to the real facts that I felt very comfortable having her be, say it's a book based on the life of Truus Weissmuller, and to the extent that things are made up in there, they are kind of filling in the spaces. Like, for example, we knew that Truus was childless, but she was childless at a time when people didn't speak of why, so we don't really know why she was childless. In The Postmistress of Paris, I took a lot more liberties with my protagonist. Her name is Nane. I don't ever call her Mary Jane Gold because she is not really Mary Jane Gold. She's inspired by Mary Jane Gold, but also by a German refugee whose name is Lisa Fitko. And the reason I varied from her story is had a lot to do with her love story, because the real Mary Jane Gold's love story, honestly, she fell in love with a guy who they called Killer, not because he was a killer, although he was a Marseille mobster, but because he massacred the English language. So that's where his name came from. And it's a lovely story. And Mary Jane Gold tells it beautifully in her memoir, which is called Crossroads Marseille 1940, which is very unfortunately out of print in the US, but you can find it in a few libraries, and also you can get it in French. But so because I knew very early on that I wanted to keep the story focused on this effort to get the artists out. I knew I wanted to tell a love story with one of the artists involved. And so I knew from the very beginning I was not going to use her real story. And so I just started from the beginning with a fictional character. Many bits of the book are homages to real Mary Jane Gold. I mean, Nane flies an airplane in that opening scene that you're talking about, Julia, because the real Mary Jane Gold did fly an airplane, and it's the exact same airplane. And I actually, for that scene, had somebody set up a flight simulator for me so I could see how that particular plane would behave in that particular scene. And she really does, the Nene, like the real Mary Jane Gold, really does have a dog named Dagobert. And as much as I would like to have made that fact up, the fact up that the Dagobert in the book barks madly at every time the name Hitler is mentioned, that is what the real Dagobert did. That's the kind of fact you find in research that's too good to let go. I mean, you can't make it that better than that. But if you look behind, even like Dagobert, if you look behind the Dagobert in my book, you will find behind his poodle face, because the real Mary Jane Gold had a poodle, you will find my last golden retriever whose name was Frodo. So that dog's personality is totally my dog's personality. So just things like that.
I'm also really curious about drawing from the other side of this love story, and draw who you drew on for the character of Edward. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's interesting. I spoke with somebody in one of my early events, and she called him Edouard, which is the way you would say it in French. And so I thought, oh, I should be saying it Edouard, but actually he's German, so I'm going to say Edward. But he is, what I did for that character, he's not drawn from any particular artist in the way that he's not inspired by any particular artist in the way that Nane is inspired by these particular women. He is, what I did for him is I read everything I could find about these artists and everything I could find about surrealist art, which personally I find daunting. So if you do too, don't worry about it. and then about the camps and about how people escaped. And then I just set it all aside and picked a picture of a guy I liked, from a magazine or on the internet, and decided, okay, he's going to look sort of like this, and just started kind of brainstorming about what he might be like. And then pretty early on, he showed up with this little toddler daughter whose name is Lukey, and Lukey's little stuffed mohair kangaroo. And that just original image of him that came out of nowhere, honestly, really just out of me putting pen to paper and trying to think. That's where he comes from.
I became very invested in that stuffed kangaroo throughout the course of the book. So Pemmy, I think,
Yeah,
her.
it's a Professor Ellie Mouse, and I will tell you that, and she's called Pemmy for short. You're absolutely right. And I will tell you a funny story about that. We were moving in the process of me writing this book, and I have that my husband gave me this little kind of rabbit family. It's just a little stuffed rabbit family, and it's a mom and a dad and a baby. And somewhere in the process of moving, the baby got separated from. This is after the first draft was written with all the baby stuff. The baby got separated from the parents and ended up in another box that wasn't unpacked. And we thought, oh my God, the babies the babies disappeared, and this is a bad omen. But then, literally a week before the book launched, the baby showed up in a box that my husband was going through in the garage
Yeah.
that he hadn't unpacked yet. So the family is reunited, and we felt that was a good omen for the book.
I
So
think that's a very good, and obviously it's done the book well. So,
I'm sure it's because we found the baby
oh,
rabbit.
absolutely, absolutely. I'm
Do you
always
have,
curious.
do you have, Julia, do you have like those kind of superstitions about writing and stuff, or are you a more rational?
I wish I had more interesting stories about things like that. I'm not a particularly sort of ritual based author. I don't have to have a certain thing around me, because I think because I used to be a journalist, and it's literally, if you don't write, you don't eat. So you sit down and you write.
Right.
So I think it's much more along those lines. For me, there are certain things that I like to do, certain processes I like to take. So certain types of, going through a draft in edits. I usually jump around. I'm not linear when I edit. For a first draft, because I find that I have the most energy when I'm at the beginning of a draft, for obvious reasons. So I try to tackle the big thing first, and then move down the list of stuff that I know is wrong, which is always a fun, identifying what's wrong is always a fun process, and having to think critically about your work. But in terms of sort of a physical object or anything like that, not really so much.
I also don't have, for writing, I don't need, I always feel like, I know writers who literally, need to have their bunny slippers on before they can write. And I thought, what do you do if your dog eats your bunny slippers? Then you can't write. So I'm like you, I came from the law, and then to a smaller extent, not from journalism, but from doing shorter works. And so, you just have to sit down and write. You have to sit down and write. And I always feel like if you are waiting for inspiration to come, you can be waiting for a long time. But if you sit down and write, then if there's inspiration there, it will show up. So I just sit down and write every day.
I will say the one thing that I'm maybe not being quite so honest about is there is one type of pen I like to write with, and this is just being neurotic about my pens. So I've tried beautiful fountain pens, I've tried all sorts of things. All I like is this one rollerball Pilot V5 pen that I had, when I was in middle school, and I've just used ever since in every color. So I have them stashed all around my flat. I have them in all my handbags. I really find it very strange using anything but this one type of pen, which sounds completely
But,
mad.
but no, no, I think that sounds perfectly rational, because I mean that's about how you get the words on the page, and if you're
Yes.
not having to worry about your pen running out of ink, you can get the words on the page much better. So I've recently changed from my laptop to a desktop, and honestly, I don't like the keyboard on the desktop, and so I find myself always going to my laptop to write, because I can write so much better with it. So that's not superstitious. That's totally rational.
That makes complete sense. I like it. Well, I was struck by this book in that I'm always looking for things that feel fresh and new, because I tend to read a lot, as I'm sure you do, of historical fiction, and a lot of historical fiction right now is focused around World War II. I've written a lot of it. I know you've written a lot of it as well. So one of the things that I always think is interesting is finding those little hooks for me as a reader that set something apart. And one of the elements of this, well, there are two big ones. One is what was happening in
Marseille.
Marseille. My apologies.
Marseille.
I can't say a couple words in the English language and a couple in the French language either. Epistolar always trips me up. But what was happening with the effort to get artists out? So that was one element, and then the other was actually what was happening to artists and various intellectuals in France. at the time as well. For people who aren't so familiar, and without giving up too much in the way of spoilers for this book, perhaps we can talk about the internment of people who were artists, intellectuals, painters, photographers, and give a bit of a sense of who these people were and what was going on in France with them.
Absolutely. So one of the things that happened after Hitler took over in Germany was that artists and intellectuals, primarily Jewish, but anybody who might have offended Hitler, which was pretty much any artist who was not producing very traditional art, ended up needing to get out of the Reich for their own safety. And so they fled, and mostly they fled to France. France at the time was a very open society. They had a Jewish leader in the 1930s. It was a very welcoming to the Jewish community. And obviously, I mean, France artists, it's like they're the same thing, right? So, and so many of them went to France, and many of them ended up on the south of France. There was a little town there called Saint-Ré-sur-Mer, which my French is not is not anything. So probably somebody could say that better. I do know how to say Marseille, but
Yeah.
so Saint-Ré-sur-Mer ended up being, kind of called jokingly, Saint-Ré-sur-Mer, France was called jokingly the capital of German literature, because so many of the great German writers ended up there in the late 30s and 1940. And then once, even before war was, even before Hitler invaded, but after war was declared, just much as we did intern Japanese Americans here in the United States, the French interned Jewish refugees, artist refugees, for fear that they were, would be spies for Hitler. Never mind that they had fled, literally fled Hitler in the last few years to get there. And so we're talking about artists like, Max Ernst, and, one of the people that was on Varian Fry's list was Picasso. Writers like Hannah Arendt, some of the great writers, some of the most world famous writers of the time were interned, and they were rounded up on very little notice and put into these camps. One of the camps that they ended up in, because so many of them were in the south of France, is Camp de Mille, which I use in the book. And one of the things that's extraordinary about it is the artists there managed to keep making art. It's in this old brick factory, dusty, the dust would fill your lungs. It made the floor lumpy to walk on. Nonetheless, in the basement of this building, it was an old brick factory, and there were all these old kilns. They took those kilns and made them into studios where they created art. They turned one of them into a Berlin-style cabaret where they, had heated discussions and just a good time together. They put on plays and wrote operas and performed them. And it feels like such a testament to the human spirit and the power of art that they kept doing that in this really difficult time. And that is totally what made me want to write this story, that hopefulness of the human spirit and that importance of art in such a complicated time.
They're really moving scenes when you see the conditions that these people are living in, when you describe those on the page, and when there's still this compulsion to create and to help each other do that as well. It's not just a solo activity. It is very communal, as you depict. I think it really says a lot about these people, and then also says a lot about what maybe could and could not be taken away from them, even when they were interned.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I feel like that's exactly right. What could and could not be taken away from them, and you could not take away their creativity. You could do anything, you could do all sorts of things to them, but you could not take away their creativity. It's a lovely thought. I've not ever heard it expressed that way, Julia, but that's really a nice way to think of it. Yeah.
Well, I'm also curious about the other side of things, which is the list of artists and the connection to the United States, the effort that was being made by Americans as well as French and other people to identify these people and hopefully get them to safety in the United States as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and familiarize people with sort of what that looked like?
Absolutely. Just to be clear, we here in the United States were not more welcoming than any of the rest of the world. Once borders started being closed around the world, we closed ours too. And so the hardest part for anybody in getting to America one of the very hard parts was getting out of wherever they were, but then also getting into America. So, like in the last train to London at that time, in that set in the late 1930s, if you could get an American visa, Hitler would let you go. You could leave the Reich, but people couldn't get American visas because we were not giving them. We were closing our borders just like everybody else. So what Varian Fry did, he was with a group that was aware that there were all these great creative minds in France. And they put together literally a list of who they could get American visas for. They kind of threw Eleanor Roosevelt, kind of shamed President Roosevelt into allowing, into insisting that they could get visas for these people. And then Varian Fry took over literally $3,000 in this list, thinking he would get them all out in 2 weeks and be back. And, in 2 weeks, he basically hadn't even found most of them because they were mostly in hiding. So that was, much of the struggle in that time was finding a place to go, because if you found a place to go, then you often could have managed to escape France in one way or another and go somewhere. But if you didn't have a place to go, you couldn't, for example, cross the border into Spain. Spain wouldn't let you in because they didn't want to be stuck with you. Portugal wouldn't let you in because they didn't want to get stuck with you. Nobody wanted, much like you see now, nobody wants refugees crossing into their country because they don't want to have to house all these people or take care of all these people or whatever. So that's what was happening. And Varian Fry got over there and was running this effort and doing it in a way that ended up offending Vichy and offending Hitler, and so that the State Department, after some time, basically told him he needed to come home. And he instead stayed, and he needed money. And so a lot of the money for the effort was provided by Mary Jane Gould, this real American Chicago heiress, who she provided much of the funds for the effort after the initial cash infusions.
She comes up with a very clever way of washing some of that cash in the book. So I thought that's smart.
It is, right? I thought so too. That is actually a real way that they brought her money in, and I also thought it was really clever. That's one of the things, right? You know this about one of the fun things about writing historical fiction is you find these real facts that are better than you can possibly make up, and so you get to use them and sprinkle them in, and it's interesting for everybody because it's real, right?
Absolutely. And I think those are the details that really bring things to life and add a lot of realism to whatever it is that you're writing, even if what you're writing is completely fictionalized.
Exactly. I always feel like, when I'm writing historical fiction, and I think your fiction is like this, true, Julia, it is fiction, but it is fiction in service of a real emotional truth, a real situation, a real what people really felt, what they really did in the circumstances. And so I think the difference between nonfiction and historical fiction is that you're sort of invited to step into somebody's shoes and not just learn about it, but feel the experience in a way that I think, for me, moves me more deeply than just reading the history, although I love reading history too. So.
Yeah, I love reading the history, but I think there's something inherently attractive to a reader, or at least a reader like me, about a narrative. And I always find myself much more emotionally invested, as you say. So because of that, I want to make sure I get as much of it right as I can. And no historical fiction book, writer, anything is ever going to be completely accurate. I can tell you about things that people have emailed me about, and I thought, all right, I'll do better with that next time. But what's really satisfying is when somebody does email you and say either I have a memory of that, or my mother used to talk about that, or my grandmother used to talk about what you said, and thank you so much for getting that right. And that's what feels really, really satisfying. And that justifies all my sitting there and reading books and researching when I should probably be drafting.
Exactly. And there is this, I always feel, there is this responsibility when you take on a story that is not yours to tell it as truly as you possibly can. When I started The Last Train to London, I had the idea for that novel for a long time, but I did not think it was my story to write because I'm not Jewish. And so I talked to my agent a bunch of times about, didn't she have somebody, a Jewish author who would like to take on this story? And she kept saying, that's your story to tell. I want you to tell that story. And so I eventually did, but only because I found Truce, and Truce is Christian. And so that a Gentile, and I thought, oh, well, okay, so of course there are Gentiles involved in this story. And I wrote it, and one of the really great pleasures of that is the number of people rescued in the Kindertransport who have said things like, well, like I did an event for a library about that book last night or night before last. I don't know, the days kind of run together, and the person who introduced me was rescued on the Kindertransport, and she said, from Vienna, which is where my book addresses, and she said, I felt like you were looking over my shoulder as I was experiencing that then. And it was so, like, that is, I would give up a million readers to have one response like that from a real person who was involved. So, but don't go away, readers, stay here.
Yes, no, stay. We want everybody to stay, but what an incredible compliment. And to know that you, again, that you got it right.
Yeah.
And it must be that moment of relief when somebody,
Huge.
yeah, absolutely. I think it can be daunting. And I know I'm writing something right now that is out of my personal experience, comfort zone. Everything is out of my personal experience with historical fiction, but this in particular is. And it's good to hear, because I'm going through some of that at the moment too.
And we all get those, I've gotten a couple emails I think it was that, yeah, for that book. I have sort of toward the end a scene in a college, and I have a matron there. It's a girls' college, and I have a matron there, and it's from a real college. And a couple of people have written me to say, I love the book and blah, 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 but there were no matrons at that college at that time. I'm like, in the U.S. it was not a U.S. college, but in the U.S. it was a women's college, and there would have been matrons. So, and it just never, it's the things that you don't think about, that you just assume and you don't think to question, that catch you up as a historical novelist, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My most embarrassing is that at the end of one book, and I'm just trying to see how I can say this without completely spoiling things. Basically, a character goes somewhere and I needed her to be employed in the war effort. So I I employed her in a munitions factory, just thinking, great, this is just sort of, broad brush. It's a cheeky little, epilogue, not a problem. And this lovely person emailed me, so polite, and said, I loved the book, and I just wanted to ask really quickly, where was the munitions factory? Because I live around there, and we had a famous disaster in World War I, and I didn't know they rebuilt the munitions factory for World War II. And I just thought, oh, I'm really embarrassed now. And I just emailed her back and I said, look, sometimes we get it wrong, and I didn't even think to check, and I'm so sorry. But
hey, that was a fictional munitions factory. That was a fictional munitions factory.
It is a fictional munitions factory, but she went looking for it, and I thought, oh no.
Yeah.
So,
and then there are also these kind of funny things that happen where you actually have it right, but you don't realize that you have had that the reader is kind of in a different place. So like my second novel is a novel called The Wednesday Sisters, and it's about women who would not in a million years call themselves feminists at the dawn of the women's movement. And it takes place in the 60s, late 60s and early 1970s, but it's all told from the retrospective point of view. So it starts in the present. The narrator is very firmly in the present before she takes you back, and then she emerges from back into the present throughout the novel, but in little ways. And one of the ways she does is towards the end of the book, and she talks about the way it's very much a book about writers. They become writers together, and she talks about the way people write, and it's something like if I had to put on bunny slippers to write, what would happen if my dog chewed the bunny slippers? And one of the things I say is, and some people need to play an iPod, the same song on an iPod on endless repeat. And that's a small nod to my friend Laura Dave, who does that with her wonderful novels. She picks one song and listens to it on endless repeat. And I knew that that was a moment where my narrator was in the present, and so she could talk about iPods, which had then existed. I tell you, I got so many letters, people telling me, but there were no iPods in the 60s and 70s, and I'm like, I do know that, and that narrator is in the present in that moment. But if I'd realized that it would jar people like that, I just would have taken it out. Was a small nod to a friend that I wish I hadn't done now. So
Yeah,
anyway.
it is funny, the little things that people pick up on that you don't even realize that you put in the book in some cases. Obviously, this was more conscious because it was a nod to a friend, as you say. But no, it's fascinating what people pick up on and what you don't realize is in there sometimes.
Right, right.
There have been entire characters that people have sort of glommed onto and said, "Oh, I love that person." I'm like, really? That's the character. Okay, I had no idea.
Right. Right. Well, I think, it's an interesting thing about reading that so many of us like to find a character we identify with and or love and follow that character. And I think plot is obviously very important in a book, but I feel like if you have a character who's engaging to people, people will follow them almost anywhere. It's a really interesting point of how writing works.
Absolutely. No, it is fascinating. And again, you're so close to it as the author that sometimes when you see people who don't have that same perspective, you think, oh, that's interesting. It's not necessarily what would have expected. So
Yeah, yeah. You thought he did what?
yeah, exactly.
Really? Okay, that's fine.
Fair enough.
Whatever you like.
Do you have a question? Speaking more about detail and research, question from Sharon: what was the most interesting thing that you discovered in your research for this book?
Oh, there are honestly so many interesting things that to pick one out is almost impossible. But I will say that before I started poking around in this, I did not know that the French had interned refugees, and so that was certainly surprising and interesting. And then seeing what the artist refugees did in that moment obviously was just beautiful and inspiring and quite moving. So.
It is perhaps unsurprisingly, given that it's a very difficult thing to reconcile and to even think about for a lot of people. But I found, so my book, The Whispers of War, has uh, deals with internment for German and then later Italian, German and Austrian, and then later Italian citizens in the UK. And there are people who grew up in the UK I talked to about it who have no idea that that was ever even a thing. And I grew up very close to, we were talking beforehand, I grew up in Pasadena, very close to Santa Anita Racetrack, which famously was used as a staging ground and then was actually used to intern some people, probably most famously George Takei. And it perhaps is just more talked about in that area, and I was in a school where we learned about that, so I've been aware of it for a very long time, but I think that in maybe people who are familiar with French, British, various other countries' history don't necessarily stumble over that immediately in the course of whatever they're reading. So I think it's always interesting to see how some of those things play out many years later in our own awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens is, obviously, just as our internment of Japanese Americans is a little bit of an embarrassment in history that we don't like to talk about, the French interning the Jewish refugees was a bit of an embarrassment, not something they like to talk about. So they just didn't, just like we just didn't for a long time. And so it's only it was only many years later that the French kind of even acknowledged that they did it and that that was them actually and not the Germans making them do it. And now there is, for anybody who's ever in France, there is this Camp de Mille, which is in this book, was preserved as a museum to remember that moment in French history. And it's an incredibly moving place to visit. It doesn't take very long. When I was there, it was me and a bunch of school kids, It's outside of Aix-en-Provence, which is a lovely place to visit. So, go to Aix-en-Provence and then go out and see Camp de Mille. It's quite a moving experience. So, yeah.
Were you actually able to travel to France for much of the research of this? Or I know with books written recently, it can be difficult timing wise with COVID.
Yeah, so what I did was, and what I'm always doing is I'm always looking forward to the next book because if I am publishing a book and I don't have a next book within reach, it's I need for me the writing is the thing, and if I could be a hermit writer and never have to come out in public, I'd probably do that. And so it's very comforting for me to, much as I really appreciate Julia having me here, and I do enjoy it when I'm in it, but so for me, I always have to have the next book in my eyesight before I can let go of the present book. And so I did much of the research for The Postmistress of Paris as I was finishing up The Last Train to London. And so I did, that was before, that book came out in the fall of 2019, right before this all happened. And so I did visit Camp de Mille. I did walk around Marseille and find the spot where Villa Herbel was, even though it's not there anymore. I did spend a lot of time in Paris looking at the surrealist art and fashion and seeing exactly where Mary Jane Gould's apartment on Avenue Foch was and things like that. So I did get to do a lot of that stuff. There is something that happens at the end of the story, which I meant to do 3 times. The first time I got sick. Let's see, the first time I got sick. The second time it was 108-degree weather and it's something energetic that you have to do outside, and so I couldn't do it. And then the third time was a trip that we had planned to go back to France that was September of after COVID. And so I didn't get to do that one. And so, one of the things you have to do is you have to fill in research. So one of the things, just serendipitously, I have a friend I practice law with. His name is Tom Pfister, and he wrote this book with his siblings about his parents, Eva and Otto. And he called me up. He knows I'm a writer. He emailed me, contacted me, and said, "Oh, could I just send you a copy of my book? It's just come out." I didn't know it had come out. I didn't know he was writing. And I said, because I would never, I always hate to say no to people I know. I said, "Oh yes, of course, send it to me and I'll look forward to reading it." And often I don't have time because I get so many books I don't have time to read. But I looked at this one, I'm like, oh, Resistance, Refugees, and Love in the Time of Hitler. That's what I'm writing. So I start reading this. It's a lovely, lovely story. It's a real story. And it covers his parents went out the same way most refugees went out that during that time, and so I ended up spending a lot of time with him. He was very generous with me with his time and with his photos, so that I basically piggybacked on his research for some stuff that happens at the end of the book. So.
It's incredible sometimes where you'll start focusing in on something and then suddenly through serendipity or something, people in your life go, "Oh, I happen to have a connection to that," or I know about and I read so and so. And it is incredible how sometimes when your focus is on something, the universe has a way of sending you the right thing that you need.
It's really funny. I don't much like to talk about the books that I'm writing next, but I'll say that the book I'm writing next is a book about books and the making of books. And I was talking to my agent about what I might like to do next, and she said, my dad was a bookbinder, right? I was like, no, I had no idea. She's like, I know all about the glues you need to know and just everything. She said that was his business for, decades. So there you go, making my research easier.
So interesting. So everybody who has a family member or themselves has an interesting job, they can just go ahead and email us and we'll store it away for research for future books and go from there.
Exactly. Exactly.
I know you mentioned obviously walking the streets and doing various things that your characters would have done in the book. How much of your research process is that? And then how much of it is sort of, on the internet, in archives, in books? What does that divide look like?
I would say the great bulk of it, much as, I like to say I don't know if I write to travel or travel to write, because I do love to travel. And so I use, what I'm writing as an excuse to go anywhere that my books take me. And a lot of those travels do end up with things falling in my lap in ways that we just talked about. But I do start with uh, deeply reading in a subject. Reading stuff that's available on the internet, reading books that are available, reading anything I can find. Like for the last train to London, I went up to the Jewish Museum in San Francisco, and they pulled a whole bunch of first person remembrances from their archives so I could go through from some of the real children who were rescued in the Kindertransport. And so I would say it's um, probably 75 that kind of research, and 25 traveling and going to places and things, and probably I could do it 90-10, but I love the traveling side of it, so I
Yeah, I
spend more
don't
time
blame
on
you.
it then. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
How
How
about
about
when
you? How about you? Do you?
Well, I do a little bit of traveling for writing, although to be honest, I've sort of been a bit cheeky. And since I moved to London, I've been writing predominantly about London or about Warwickshire, which is where my parents are based. So it's very easy for me to access those things. The book that I'm writing right now is based in Liverpool, and I haven't gotten up there yet. But while the book is with my editor, I am going to go up, and I need to do some on the ground research. You're absolutely right. There is something about, for me at least, there's something about knowing a place, especially when a lot of what what's the best way to put this? A lot of what I'm writing, the geographical layout of the city matters, which I need to know sort of how you get across the city, how you move through neighborhoods, where certain things are in relation to others. And Google Maps is really helpful, and Street View and things like that is really useful. But sometimes there is something very specific about being able to see a place, smell a place, know what the air feels like, especially in the north of England. I lived in Manchester for about 7 months, and I know that is one of the rainiest cities in Britain. And let me tell you, it feels different than it does down here in London when you're sort of out and about. One of the things you can't do is wear your hair like this because it will just sort of frizz out.
Yeah.
Um, so
I'm in Carmel, so.
yeah, so you just realize that there are different things that slightly different ways that you live your life. So for me, I do like being able to go and do those things. My partner is very talented with French, and there is a project that I have sort of brewing in the background, and it's not going to be this year or next year. It's probably going to be the year after, but he was very excited because I told him we might need to go to Normandy for that. So he is ready to be chief of translation and tour
Oh,
guide and all sorts of things.
and you don't need him this year because I may be looking for somebody to go to Paris and look at some things for me in Paris. So
Oh, well, there you go.
we
You
might
just
have
let
to
us
talk.
know. So,
Yeah. I do think I totally agree with you on this. Getting to places, and sometimes you can learn about what you know is there, and that is relatively easy to find in one way or another on the internet or through a book or whatever. But also, there's the things that you don't know are there. So, like my fifth novel, I think it was called The Race for Paris. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read it, cover your ears, but it goes on past Paris. It's about women journalists in World War II France wanting to be the first to report the liberation of Paris. It goes on past Paris into the Netherlands. And into a town called Valkmaar in the Netherlands. No, not Valkmaar. That's Valkmaar's. Anyway, a town in the Netherlands, in the south of the Netherlands, that has these caves. And I had a scene that I was going to set in, and I knew there were two caves there, and I'd read about them, and I decided to set the scene in this one cave. But so very late in the process, I do like to go visit places after I know what I need to know, right? Very late in the process, I went and saw those caves. And the first cave is like, oh, this is a nice cave. The other cave was like, wow, this is so evocative. And so I picked up my characters in that scene and moved them from that first cave into the other cave. And if I hadn't gone there, I would not have known the details of that other cave. And I never would have been able, that scene would not have been half the scene it was. So I do think there's a lot to be gained in visiting the real places.
absolutely. And I think there's a lot to be gained about researching once you know a bit more about what you need to know. I have one friend who does almost all her research up front, and then she writes the book. And that works wonderfully for her because she really needs to immerse herself in everything. And I'm that author who's got all sorts of editing notes all over a draft, being like, figure out what that is because you didn't know that you needed that when you first sat down. And I've had a few books where I've realized I've finished a draft and I thought, this is great. And then I step away from it and I come back to it and I think to myself, everybody does everything in the same room. We need to move around a little bit. And that's also part of the process, is figuring out, what are you going to do with your characters? What can you add that layers in detail and makes it more rich, makes it more interesting for a reader also.
Right. Do you, Julia, do you write, do you revise as you write, or do you write and then start revising?
This is one of the big dividing questions for writers.
That's why I ask.
I'm very strict with myself. Unless something is so broken that I feel like I can't move forward and I'm hitting my head against a brick wall, I will sit down and I will write the book. And I don't let myself skip scenes either. If I'm really struggling with a scene, it probably means that either I'm finding it boring or I don't know enough about why I need to be writing that scene. So if I can pull it out, I'll move past it and pull it out, put it in a cut file that I never ever look at, but I keep anyway because it makes me feel better about myself. And I'll continue on until that draft is done. And then I'll go through and do a pretty hard edit on what I've written. I would say I'm a fast drafter, except every book I've written keeps getting longer and more complex with every first draft that I do. So yeah, that's kind of my approach to it. Are you a reviser?
I do the same thing. You know, my first novel, because I didn't know what I was doing. I was coming out of the practice of law, and I was not a writer, and so I would revise and get everything perfect on a chapter. And then I learned in the process of that you don't know what's going to stay until you have. I don't know what's going to stay until I have a full draft. And so I ended up spending, months editing chapters that then ended up in the garbage can. And so I do what you do, which is, start at the beginning, go through, get to the end, and then step back and say, okay, what have I got here? What do I need? What needs to be different? And if I have something that I already know is a big problem, if it's a big problem that I need to work out going forward, then I will go work out that particular problem, make a note that I need to flow it through to X page, and then go back to X page and keep going. But if it's something that's not on that scale, then I'll just sticker it. I work in Scrivener, and I'll just put in brackets, fix this,
Yes.
this problem, fix it. And then after I have a draft, I go back and do a search for brackets and find the brackets and fix the things that need to be fixed. And I find that so much more efficient for me than trying to make everything perfect as I go along. But I do know writers who, they can't go to the next sentence until they know that the sentence they've just written is perfect. I'm like, I would never get anywhere.
No, me neither. And I think a lot of the reason for me is that although I go in knowing a lot about my characters, I always feel like there is something unexpected that happens, or I sit there and I realize that whatever motivation I thought they had either isn't deep enough and doesn't fully explain their logic, or doesn't make sense for the book that I'm writing. So what I need to do is change elements of the plot in order to make that character behave in a way that's a lot more believable. And so I do find it very difficult, the idea of holding one truth in my head all the way through a book, because it's always evolving and changing.
Right. And so many things flow through. I mean, so if you change one thing in chapter one, that goes through the whole book. And so revising is I love revising. I love having a draft. My least favorite part of this process is doing the first draft. I love having a draft and then figuring out how to make it better. That's my sweet spot for writing.
I agree. And also that moment where you get a note from an editor who says, this is great. It just these little things. And you think, I'm going to have to take the entire book apart and put it back together again, because that's not a little thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, when I'm writing first drafts, sometimes I think a book is going to be about one thing, and then it ends up being, in some ways, I mean, it's never not about that one thing, but sometimes the more important part of it is some other element. So like, for The Postmistress of Paris, it started out as an adventure story and a story about, about this crazy, wonderful brave American woman. And in the end, I realized that it's really very much about, it's far more about leaving. So she's somebody who stays. She's somebody who stays, but it's very much more about leaving a home behind, which in fact is something that she has done before the book even opens. And I hadn't focused on that part of her story until I had written a draft, and I was like, oh, I see. She's left just as these refugees are leaving, and isn't that interesting? And what can I do with that? But the whole first draft, I was not thinking about her part of leaving too. So
That's so interesting because that's such a deeply emotional thing throughout the book. And there is a lot of emotion in, underpinning this novel. It's very, very character driven. So it's so interesting hearing that it started out in this other life in the first
yeah,
draft.
yeah, yeah. I just I find the hardest part of anything is starting. And so when people ask me, well, how do you start writing? My answer is any way I can. I do anything there is to do. I journal, I do outlines, I do something I call my card outline, which is just those little, this will show my age, but those little 3x5 cards that you use to make notes for term papers and stuff. And I at some point in time in the process, usually after I have a kind of some characters in a few chapters, I just sit down with a stack of those cards and I just write ideas for what might happen in the book. I just write an idea and literally throw it on the floor. Another idea, throw it on the floor. Another idea, throw it on the floor. And what that does for me is it turns off my editor. Because if my editor is on, every single idea that I have at some point in time looks stupid as anything. And so I would have absolutely nothing if I let my editor hang out with me all the time, my personal internal editor. But it is really nice when you have that, when you get that response from your editor. It is always way more than they think it's going to be. It's just,
Yeah.
they think it's little things. But it is nice that they think it's only a little thing that needs to be
Yeah.
fixed,
It's
so.
kind of like tap there. What is it? The duck that looks calm or the swan that looks calm above the water and is paddling like crazy underneath.
Yeah,
Those things happen
exactly.
sometimes.
Exactly. All of life as a writer is lived under the surface, paddling as fast as we can, for sure.
Exactly. Do you think that some of that sort of method comes from your law background, or are there other ways that law has influenced the way that you write?
I think the best thing that the law did for me in terms of being a writer is teach me discipline. I somehow or another ended up at a pretty good U.S. law school at a time when there weren't that many women yet in the law, and I arrived with no discipline whatsoever. It's just dumb luck that I did well enough in college, and that I can take a standardized test very well, so that I could get into a good law school. But what I found very quickly was that you cannot survive in a pretty good law school unless you are pretty well disciplined and organized. And so most of my organizing and discipline comes from those years in law school and then practicing law. I was a corporate lawyer, which is a storyteller of sorts. You're telling the stories of,
Sure.
of corporations. But it's also, a lot of what I did was make sure that all 800 pieces of paper that needed, 6 or 7 or 8 signatures each, ended up signed and on the closing table in time to close a big deal. And you didn't have the right piece from some Secretary of State, then $1 billion of money would be sitting there looking at you saying, you don't have what. So I learned organization skills then, and those have served me very well, especially at this point of writing, of getting out there and telling people about a book that you've already written, but also in the writing of it, just sitting down and writing it every day. So
Both.
you were a journalist beforehand, so that's a whole different background,
Well,
but probably some of the same things.
it is, but it's funny. It is the discipline that really it teaches you. As I said before, you don't write, you don't eat. So it's really straightforward in some ways. And I think also it teaches you to shove a bit of the internal editor aside because you know that that is part of the process. You trust that part of the process. I always liked being edited, and I was an editor myself in journalism, not in publishing. Um, and I think there's really something magical about that process where you're going through and really getting at the core of something, peeling back a lot of the layers of stuff that's there, because every draft comes with stuff that just needs to be chipped away. And I think that really helps. I think the other thing that's helpful is I think, although this maybe isn't the experience of every journalist, I think that it taught me that writing can also very much be a business. And as not glamorous as I'm sure that sounds, as unglamorous as that sounds to a lot of people, to make this work and to make it a career, I think that the discipline and the sense that, it's a business. And so there are certain things that you need to be willing to do for it, to support the book, to support your writing career, and also to take on, advice from people you trust, like your agent. That was really helpful very early on. I think it cured me of any sort of romantic notions of what being an author, in a garret writing in Paris would be like. As lovely as that would be, that's not been my experience. So it's very different than I think some people would expect.
Yeah, I agree with you. First of all, and the first thing you said, which is, a good editor is a thing of beauty. I mean,
Yes.
I have learned so much from editors, and I never can understand why people don't. I think if you don't like being edited, then you don't have the right editor,
Mm.
because books are a collaboration, and I feel like my editor helps me see things that I don't see. I can do books so much faster because she's a good editor, and she'll say, how about this, and she just hones in on those weak points in the book, and helps me, stuff that I used to have to sit stuff in a drawer and pull it out 3 months later so I can see it. I can instead send it to her, and she'll say, how about this? And I'll go, oh yeah, okay, and I fix it, and it's much faster. Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah.
also in terms of being a business, I mean, I write for love, and I think you do. Anybody who's writing to be rich or famous, I would advise you to go to law school. You
Yeah.
can be much richer and probably just as famous that way. But it is so. I do think you have to have that love and passion for writing. But that having been said, it is a business for everybody involved in the process, except maybe you. And so, if you embrace that and recognize that, it makes the writing life much easier, because you can say, okay, I see this book means this to me, and it means that to this other person. And always the answer is going to be, it means more to you than to anybody else in the world. And so if you embrace that and own that, and approach it that way, it will serve you well in writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's excellent advice. I am enjoying this so much. I could talk to you for ages and ages, but I'm also mindful of the fact that it's the holiday season, and you have a whole day to start because you're on the West Coast of the
I'm on the
US.
west. Uh,
So before we
I-
go, I would love to know some recommendations of books that you've been reading and loving, or just want to tell people about in particular.
Oh, absolutely. So I already talked about Eva and Otto. It is an incredibly moving story. It involves a journal that, if this weren't a friend of mine and he hadn't already written this book, had I heard about it, I would totally write a book about that situation. So that's really lovely. A lot of the things I tell you, a lot of things that I read, it's kind of the nature of being an author, are stuff that is not out yet. So I was trying to think of what I've read that is out, and I'm sure I've read some wonderful things. I read Laura Daves. Let's see, do I have that? Her new one, and the title is totally escaping me. It was just wonderful. It was a Reese Witherspoon pick. I've been reading everything that she's written, and since I met her before she ever published anything, and she's lovely. But most of the stuff there's are stuff that's coming out. So there's a book by Karen Joy Fowler. She was the first American ever shortlisted for the Booker Prize. She's a really lovely person, and she has a new book coming out in March called Booth, and it is fantastic. So definitely watch for that. There's a woman named Elizabeth Mackenzie who was longlisted for the National Book Award for her, I guess it was her second novel, and she has a new novel coming out, I think maybe not until the fall, or maybe in the spring of next year, so maybe I shouldn't even be talking about it yet, but it's called The Dog of the North, and it is really wonderful. And Katie Hafner, who's a San Francisco Bay Area author, has a new book coming out called The Boys. I I read it for blurb, and it's going to come out with my little blurb on the galley. This is a bound manuscript. I think it's coming out in the summer, and it is just one of the most charming things I have read in a long time. As is, I will say, The Dog of the North. So it's interesting. You get these books, and you've just read them, and they're all you want to talk about, and you realize if I talk about that, nobody's going to be able to get it yet. But you can pre-order it, so just go ahead and
Yes, and
pre-order
put
it.
it on
Just go ahead and
Goodreads
pre-order
forever.
it. Yeah. What have you been
Wonderful.
reading that's good? What have you been reading that's good?
No, I also am in a bit of that sort of end of a draft squirrel brain for me as well. But I've just read, well, I've just read your book, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. And again, if you guys haven't read it yet, there's a lot of love for it in the comments, which is rightly so. But I also just recently read Christy Woodson Harvey's The Wedding Veil, which is her first dual timeline book. It comes out in March, but it follows a sort of possibly missing Vanderbilt wedding veil and a couple different generations of women. And it's got a lot of her signature wit and a lot of her charm to it as well. So I enjoyed those very much. I think over Christmas, I'm just going to let my brain relax a little bit and just mood read a little bit, figure out what it is that I feel like reading. So I don't have any hard and fast plans yet, but I will definitely be reading more before the end of the year.
Yeah, me too. My kids are coming home literally tonight. I have two sons, they're grown, but have the blessing of having them home for the holidays this year. And what we like to do is, especially this time when there's not that much to do anyway, we like to sit around the fire and read together and talk and all that kind of stuff. So I'm hoping to get a lot of reading done in the next couple of weeks. It'll be
That
nice.
sounds wonderful. Well, again, the book is the Postmistress of Paris. Would you mind telling people where they can find you and the book online?
I am at megwaiteclayton.com. I'm also on Facebook at Novelist Meg. I'm almost everywhere. I guess I'm on Twitter. I think I'm Meg W. Clayton. On every place else, I'm Meg Waite Clayton. I love to engage with readers, so please join me there. And what was the other part of that question? Where
Where
to
they can
find me
find the
online?
book?
Oh, you can find the book. I think in England it comes out in January, I believe. Somebody's just sent me a schedule for a blog tour, so I assume that's when it's coming out. But in the United States, it's out everywhere. It's an Indie Next Pick. They do a list of their favorite books every month, and it's a December Indie Next Pick. So absolutely, if you have a local bookstore, go ask them for it. If they don't have it, they can order it for you. I know because the Good Morning America announcement was just Friday, and nobody knew about it before then. A lot of the stores have sold out, but they will order it for you. A lot of them have already restocked, and I know HarperCollins is doing a big push to get those books in the stores. It's a Book of the Month pick, so you can get it through Book of the Month if you're Book of the Month. And of course, there's always your regular online retailers and big stores and stuff. So and then it's in Canada too. So if anybody's out there from Canada, it's everywhere in Canada as well. And it's coming to the rest of the world in other languages next year, mostly next year. So I think the first one will be Dutch, which is in maybe February. I'm not sure. So. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much. This has been really a pleasure and a wonderful way to round out the 2020 schedule of author interviews.
Really lovely, Julia, chatting with you. And when your new one comes out, we'll have to do this on my Facebook page.
I would love that. I would absolutely love that. We'll have to chat about that.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Happy holidays and see
Happy
you in the new
holidays.
year. Bye.